Good afternoon. Welcome to the session on American economic power. I'm Matt Murray. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. We've got a great panel here today. Many familiar faces here. Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, Stacey Cunningham from the NYSE, David Rubenstein from Carlyle Group, Liz Schuler from the AFL-CIO, and Ken Rogoff from Harvard, the economist. Great to have you here. Thank you for being here. Brian, I'm going to start with you. So let's talk a little bit about the outlook and where we are right at this minute. The U.S. had a strong year economically. Markets were rough, especially toward the end of the year. Volatility was high. The IMF has pulled back, particularly in Europe, its growth forecasts right now. How strong right now does the U.S. look to you in the wake of all this?
So let's sort two points of view. One is the point of view of the research team in Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and they have 2019 at basically 2.5% U.S. GDP growth, in 2020 at 1.9. They peeled that down just a little bit over the last period of time here, but and they expected 18 to finish at 3%. The thing that I'd say that we also then have is a perspective of what we see in our system and our customers. So on a given year, our consumers will consume cash, make payments, consumer only, of $3 trillion. And that grew at 8.5% of 18 over 17, which is about 6% over 17 over 16. So it was accelerating. It's still strong so far in January, but it's the first few weeks, and we'll see how it ends up. But it's still strong, running strong. So U.S. consumer spending, credit is strong in U.S. consumer, and our business customers are still optimistic. They're not quite as optimistic for a lot of the issues we'll get into, and I won't start citing them all because it's obvious, but they're not as optimistic as maybe at the high point, but the optimism in their current environment is higher than it would have been 2-3 years ago in terms of their views of what they can do and what the future can bring. And so I think you got from both the experts that spend all the time looking at this and thinking about this, and then you've got the actual consumer activity. It looks like it's a solid year for U.S., but a less growth than last year, and therein lies the great debate, which is a slowdown never feels as good as a speed up, and that's what we're all here in Davos to talk about.
Yeah, and Stacey, how do the markets feel to you right now with the volatility after December? And they're still more active, even though they've come.
They are, and I think if you look at the volatility profile over the past couple of years, actually, it's been more interesting, I think, early on, prior to October, because there was no volatility in the market, and that, frankly, was very unusual. There were the market typically doesn't like uncertainty, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. There were a lot of open questions, and yet the markets were pretty calm until October. And so really October, November, December, we saw volatility really pick up pretty dramatically. And it's calmed down a little bit in January, so it's certainly quiet. I mean, the end of the year of December, with that, you see market volumes increase too, because there's a lot of activity. Typically, when the markets are volatile, it's usually on the way down, and that's when there's a lot more concern and investor confidence is at risk.
Do you think there's a certain higher level of sort of volatility and uncertainty that's just going to be with us for a while, even if it's calmer?
I think we will see a little bit more than we had seen historically through that period of time. I mean, it feels a little bit more normal, and we have to put things into perspective. The numbers are a lot bigger. Yeah. You know, when you're looking at a Dow at this level, it's certainly, you see a 1,000-point swing. It's pretty dramatic, but a 2-3% swing is not unheard of in the market. So there is a reaction that it's a lot worse than it actually is, although there are a number of factors that contribute to what we saw with volatility. I mean, there is certainly something to the fact that markets are more automated and that there is more reaction in an automated fashion to news that then trickles down through a lot of mechanisms. And it's not just quant traders, which I know Secretary Mnuchin had spoken out on the volatility in the market and what's going on there, and is that a shift in dynamic? But when people are reacting with technology, it typically reacts more quickly, and frankly, the markets are much more fragmented than they ever have been, which I think does have more of an impact when markets are volatile than when they're not volatile.
Just the fixed income piece of that, so Stacey, and the equities is, you also have a market structure. People confuse market structure with sort of the types of things Stacey talked about. Also, the fund flows into funds that were doing high yield and buying. There were one-way buyers and one-way sellers. Was pretty impactful in the last quarter. Last quarter, but really, frankly, after Thanksgiving to the end of the year, where their flows dried up, they had outflows, and they have to sell. And that's when you saw spreads and high yield blow out a little bit. You've seen it settle back down, but people forget there's two types of market structure. One is sort of where the equity balances and how they run, and algorithms and all that stuff. There's another one, which is who owns the assets and what's their position given the quarter.
I want to go to David, because you saw Jay Powell last week. How do you think the Fed's reading this and reacting to this?
Yeah, I had a chance to interview him at the Economic Club of Washington, and Jay's pal is a person who had worked at my firm for a number of years, so I've known him quite a long time. And I think his main message was that the earlier view that the Fed was likely to increase interest rates perhaps twice in the early part, first 6 months of this year, was probably not now accurate. Fed speak is not something he normally talks in. He's a lawyer by training, not a PhD in economics. Not that being a PhD in economics is a bad thing, but he talks tries to talk in a very down-to-earth way, and I think he felt that some people had misinterpreted his earlier views, and he tried to clarify, and I think it's now clarified. Let me just step back for a minute to answer your question the way you phrased it. In June of 2009, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the entity that we have in the United States that determines whether you're in or out of a recession. The United States government doesn't want to be blamed for saying we're in a recession or out of a recession, so they outsourced it to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And they said in June of 2009, the recession's over. Now, if you didn't have your job back, you didn't agree with that, but that was generally the view. In June of 2019, we will be out of a recession for 10 years. Now, that is a very long time, historically, just about the longest since World War II. So for the last year or two, people have been saying, wait a second, this is a very long growth period. Something's got to go wrong at some point because people just are nervous. And because of that, they've been looking for things that could go wrong. The principal things that could go wrong and put us back into recession were a war with China, let's say a trade war or some other kind of economic war. Secondly, the U.S. deficit and debt got out of control. Entitlements are out of control. We just can't control our spending. Brexit, the interest rate increases. And those things have all, come along forward. I think now Brexit is still a great issue of uncertainty. People don't know how it's going to come out, so people are jittery about that. They're not as jittery right now as I think they should be more jittery about U.S. deficit and debt. Whatever the reason, people don't obsess over that the way they probably should with $21 trillion of federal debt and $1.2 trillion of annual deficit. But that's not a concern. I think the trade war with China, people generally think we will resolve that in the next 2 or 3 months, mostly because the American government recognizes that it's not helpful to the economy, and I think the Chinese government recognizes they need to get a deal done. They can't just say we're not going to do anything much longer because this administration is going to do something about it. So the principal issue that people are now focused on is not the trade deficit or the deficit with China or the war with China, and not interest rates. It's really Brexit, whether Brexit can really impair the entire European economy and in fact of the United States, but also the shutdown. We've never had a shutdown this long in the United States government. I don't know of any other country in the world that operates this way. I think any of you have been in negotiations for some time. You play hard for a while, and you think the other side has weaker ability to negotiate against you than you realize they do. The result is you sometimes find you're at loggerheads, and that's what's happening now. The Democrats and the Republicans have themselves in a position they don't really want to be in. They want to get out of this. They don't know it's not helpful. They know they're going to both be blamed for it. It's not going to be good for any incumbent office holder. I do think in the next short period of time, something will get worked out because both sides know they have to get it done. But if it doesn't get worked out soon, the impact on the U.S. economy will be significant. And I don't think we know exactly how significant because we've never had econometric models that can model exactly what the impact is. But just think about this. If you are trying to get a permit from the federal government, you're trying to get a tax refund from the federal government, you're trying to get some kind of a regulatory approval from the federal government, you can't get that. Well, that's going to impact the economy, and it's not just a matter of paying the workers back so they get their back pay. It's the effects on the entire economy, and it's going to be felt, even if the shutdown is over, it's going to be felt for, I'd say, a month or two after that. So I think that's a big, big worry. If it can be resolved, as I think it can be, I think this year will not be a year of recession, but I think if we don't resolve that in the reasonable future, it can really impair the economy in the United States.
That's a good segue, Liz, for you, because, look, we did have a year of big wage growth, which had been sort of the thing we hadn't seen enough in the recovery last year. We do see unemployment low, but we are in the middle of the shutdown. How do things feel, in your view, for workers and average consumers right now?
Well, I'm here bringing the perspective of 12.5 million working men and women in the United States, and I think we're not alone in terms of a worker perspective on how things are going in the economy in the U.S. It's globally. People are feeling very insecure and very unsteady. And right now, immediately, we have 800,000 working men and women in our government that are on furlough, and many are working without a paycheck. It's just astounding. And I think folks think, well, why do I raise that? What does that have to do with anything? Well, it is a political crisis, and most people think of it in those terms, but it is a crisis in terms of work and the power imbalance that we are seeing between workers and employers in our country, and our ability for workers to really get their fair share of the wealth that they create in our country. And we're seeing uprisings right now in the US and across the globe of workers who are just saying, we've had enough. We just had a teacher's strike in Los Angeles, 30,000 teachers walking the picket line, yes, for more pay, but also for smaller class sizes, to say, we shouldn't have to teach with 40 kids in a classroom. We shouldn't have to go without nurses and counselors in our schools. So that is the crisis point that workers are feeling. And I think it's not, as I said, just in the US, but certainly the US has always led in terms of making sure that we have a fair shake for working people. And so with the sectors like Amazon and Uber, who are trying to look to a different model of employment, we're seeing very similar results where workers are saying, hey, wait a second, we thought if we worked a fair day's pay, we get a fair day's wage, and the ability to access good, high quality health care and retirement security. But that is not the case. We're seeing a race to the bottom, and we believe that the U.S. needs to be a leader. The U.S. needs to show the world our values and promote fair trade and democracy and workers' rights through the ability to come together collectively and raise wages and raise standards for working people.
So it doesn't sound like, in your view, workers are feeling that happy right now.
Workers are not happy.
So Ken, put it in perspective from your view of the outlook right now and some of the risk factors. One we haven't talked about that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is the China slowdown numbers and what impact that might have in the U.S. But do things look fairly sanguine to you right now, or do you have concerns?
But I would echo what David ended with, which is the shutdown, if it continues, I think will be very problematic. Normally, when we look at a government shutdown lasting a week, it's very painful, but it's like a localized natural disaster. Mm-hmm. If it lasts 2 weeks, it's like you had one in one place and a slightly worse one in another place. But if it goes on that you have a worse one every week, and it goes on for weeks and weeks and months, we don't even know what the effect would be. So I don't think Kevin Hassett's estimate of zero growth, if it's still going through March, is crazy at all. I think China's in more fundamental issues, more fundamental problems than the United States. China's experiencing more fundamental problems. I realize the Chinese here don't agree with that, and they've been amazing for a long time. But fundamentally, if you centralize power and you want to decentralize the economy to have a more innovative economy, that has not been a prescription for growth in the long run. And I think they're starting to feel that, along with a number of other things. It's radiating out. I think that is actually a significant piece of what Europe's feeling. Mm. We feel it through the financial markets initially, but over time, there are many other ways it could affect us.
Okay, so
Can
that's
I
a
just
good.
Say also on the shutdown, I'm sorry.
No?
I just had a call last night about the aviation system. And people aren't experiencing the shutdown personally quite yet. But if you were to hear what I heard from air traffic controllers and pilots, you would probably not be leaving this meeting on an airplane right now to head back to the U.S. because these mechanical systems that normally are inspected, the equipment could have failures that normally would be prevented by inspectors that are on the job. And the fact that we are stretching people's capacity to endure this stress is going to have an immediate effect on us and our families. And that's when I think finally people will have to say an end to the shutdown, when they are really feeling it at home.
You suggest we stay here until it's resolved. Everybody can stay here.
Yeah.
I won't say that
would make a
explicitly,
statement.
but you get the message.
That was scary.
Yeah.
So,
and
so,
that's
so
what it is.
that's a segue. What Ken said too, David. That's a segue to you. So, we're 2 years into the Trump administration here. Those of us who've been here a few times didn't imagine that there would be a time when we were 2 years in. It was such a shock for so many people here. Look, you come from a different political party than the president. You've got a record here now where they gave a big tax break that business wanted a long time. We did see growth go ahead last year. We are seeing the loosening of regulation. We are seeing low unemployment. The economy grew for 3% for the first time in a decade. We do see continued government dysfunction, of course, as we're just discussing. What kind of credit or blame do you give the president for the record in the state we're at right
First, I did work for President Carter about 40 years ago, and I managed to get inflation to 19%. And I haven't been invited back to government since then. I don't give money to any political party or political candidate ever. I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center and the Library of Congress Board and the Smithsonian. I think it's best to stay out of politics. I'm registered as an independent. So I'm not for or against any party. I try to do the best I can with working with both of them. To answer your question, I think that the administration deserves some credit for getting a tax bill through. It's not a perfect tax bill, but I do think it helped stimulate the economy a bit. I do think it could have been improved in many ways, but it has some pluses to it. I do think that the deregulatory effort of the administration has had some pluses to it. I do think that the international order that grew up after World War II can be questioned. I mean, NATO's not perfect, UN is not perfect, WTO's not perfect, World Bank's not perfect, IMF's not perfect. All those organizations were largely put in place after World War II, and they can be modified and improved like any organization. Nobody's perfect. So I think some of the questioning, while it may not have been as articulate or as eloquent as William Shakespeare would have done had he proposed some of these changes, I think nonetheless some changes might be appropriate. I do think the president communicates in ways that are different than other presidents have done, and there's no doubt that other presidents will no doubt follow him. I don't think Abraham Lincoln is in danger of being overlooked as an eloquent person, but I do think that if Abraham Lincoln were around today, he might be tweeting as well. It's a very effective way to get your message out. And when you think about it, how many of you tweet to people, or how many of you follow people that are tweeting? And it's a very effective way to get your message out. And I think the president found a good way to do that. He says some things that I don't agree with, and some things that I think have some merit. But generally, I think the president will get blamed for the shutdown more than he would like if it doesn't get resolved soon. And I think the final point we have to remember is that generally, when presidents get their recessions out of the way early and they have the economic growth towards the latter part of the first term, they get reelected. Jimmy Carter had a recession towards the end. That wasn't good. George Herbert Walker Bush had a recession toward the end. Wasn't good. Ronald Reagan got his recession out of the way early. That was good for him. So I think the danger that you have if you keep artificially keeping the economy going in ways that maybe it shouldn't be, and then you just can't, you run out of steam towards the re-election period of time, and there's a recession, you're going to get blamed for it. So you have to make sure that you're not propping up the economy artificially, and at some point some bad thing comes along, and all of a sudden you're in a recession when you're running for re-election. And that's his biggest risk in re-election in terms of recession.
Brian, you were vocally supportive of the tax cut bill last year. You described a pretty benign scenario with your outlook. How much credit do you give the administration for where we're at?
The tax bill, there's focus on the rate, but the piece that got lost in a lot of dimension is the territorialism, territorial methodology, which was really the really difficult thing for the United States, and it led to really the strange stuff. And so I think that those two pieces together, if you were here last year, what surprised me going around Davos was that the amount of foreign institutions, foreign companies that said, I'm coming to the U.S. because you have all this good stuff, which we all can talk about. But what I wouldn't do before is the tax rate was so far out of line. And so that's been interesting. For our company, the core tax benefit's been a total of $500 million because we took a big charge and then have been earning it back. So a lot of people saying, oh my God, you're buying back stock from tax bill. We're buying back stock from the earnings factor. We earned $28 billion last year. It has nothing to do with the tax bill, and it would have had nothing to do with the tax bill, even in normal things. So you're going to see those benefits actually be interesting in the next year and two, how they mature into the system. And then we shared, we shared it with our employees. So we did 2 rounds. We did $1 billion of extra value to everybody but the top 5% of the employees. 2 tranches, one last year, one this year. $1 billion above everything else. So we tried to share the benefits there, increased our philanthropic commitment for this year from $2 to $250 million per year in cash philanthropy. We did a lot of things. So I think that stuff is still coming through the system, but the core benefit rate which had to get the point was competitive, or people were starting to shift. The globalization being the big issue that we're all discussing here. In the end of the day, multinational companies have something different in this demand today than they had for generations, which is the ability to both access materials, produce goods, and sell into final demand that is worldwide. That's the difference than 20, 30, 40 years ago, where most of the demand was still in a few.
So I mean, that's pretty.
It completely changes the dynamic. So you have to be competitive for the tax rate, or else they're going to just move over and make money there.
Do you agree with that, Stacey? Do you think companies are getting what they had hoped for and wanted here?
I think so, but I just want to take one step back for a second and just touch on something that David mentioned when he talked about communication style and Twitter. I actually think that's really a significant shift for a lot of reasons. We've spent a lot of time here this week talking about the divide and that people feel disconnected from government and unprotected. And Liz mentioned too that shift in power, the balance of power. And that's why I think the social media has been so effective, because the everyday person feels like they're getting direct communication to them and they feel part of that. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the power that President Trump recognized in using that as a tool. And I think that's really important, and that's probably why it will be copied, right?
Look, how many he has on his following? How many Twitter followers? You have 50-some million? Yeah. I mean, who has the most? Drake or somebody has 150 million, but I'm not on Twitter.
I don't keep
Klaus
track
Schwab,
of
I think. I think
Who
Trump
has
is
the
second.
most?
Klaus Schwab, I think.
He has the most. He deserves the most. I'm not on it because I'm afraid I'd only have 1 or 2 followers, and it's embarrassing if you only have 1 or 2 followers. So I don't do it.
David, I'll give you
You
one.
can actually buy Twitter followers too.
Oh, maybe I should do that. One of the things I've always wondered about is Twitter stock price should be 10 times higher than it is because there's so many people who use it. But I don't want any shares in it. I just want to comment on the deficit and debt for a moment, because the tax bill, more or less, was said to be increasing the federal deficit over a 10-year period of time, or debt, by about 1.2 to 1.5 trillion, depending on economic assumptions. And we kind of tolerated that because it was over 10 years and so forth. But we do have to remember, we have in the United States roughly 21 to 22 trillion dollars of total indebtedness. About 18 or so of that is maybe external debt, and the rest is probably internal debt for accounting purposes. And it's a serious amount of debt. We have a budget in the United States of roughly $4.2 trillion a year, $4.2 trillion, and we borrow about a trillion or $1.2 trillion of that. So we really have revenues of about $3 trillion or so. We can't sustain this for very long. There's only 5 ways to solve this problem. One is you default on your debt. That's not a good answer. 2, you go to the IMF for a bailout. The IMF cannot really afford to bail us out, I don't think. 3, you can inflate your way out of this, as I tried to do when I was in government. A lot of inflation, but it needs a lot of inflation to do that. So you really have only 2 other ways to do it. You grow your way out of it with enormous amount of economic growth, but that's probably unrealistic to grow at 4 and 5% given the size of our economy. So you have to really cut spending a bit and increase taxes somewhat in some ways. That's the only way you're going to solve this problem. At some point, the markets are going to wake up and say, we can't tolerate this anymore. And we've been able to tolerate it because interest rates have been so low. When interest rates go higher, as they eventually will, the debt is going to cost us not $350 or $400 billion a year, but $600, $700 billion a year. It'll squeeze out the rest of the federal government programs.
So luckily, we have a debt specialist on this panel. How worried are you about what you see, Ken, right now?
Well, I think the fact is the global interest rates keep going down and down and down, and advanced country debts keep going up and up and up, and private debt and corporate debt, and it's definitely a medium-term, long-term problem.
Medium-term meaning, when you say medium-term?
10 years.
10 years.
Eventually, something will happen. We finance our debt very short-term compared to, say, the United Kingdom and other countries. I mean, the real problem is that there are a lot of people who just believe it doesn't matter. And, Dick Cheney famously said deficits don't matter. And I think Republicans believe deficits don't matter if it's a tax cut. And Democrats believe deficits don't matter if it's a government spending hike. And, you just keep spiraling
There
up.
don't seem to be a lot of voices in either party right now for restrained spending.
Well, I mean, it makes sense as interest rates get lower and lower, surprisingly, to react to that. They're lower than expected, and to react to that. Can I just comment on how much credit should Trump get?
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say I don't give money to either political party, although I don't think either one cares compared to David whether they get money. But I think that, obviously he inherited a very benign environment Growth was very good. I believe that recovering from a financial crisis takes a long time, and we have been doing that. We're continuing to heal, and it's surprising how many people are still coming into the labor force. But it has been very benign, and my greatest concern, frankly, is I was just realizing I was told I was replacing Steve Mnuchin at the last moment, although he was an actor in the movie Rules Don't Apply, and I guess that now he's living that. But my greatest concern is that during the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, the only crisis the United States has faced has been the Trump presidency. And what if there really is something, when you need grown-ups in the room, and I respect the Federal Reserve, but it really worries me. And by the way, we could go over to the UK and say even worse.
Can I go to you, Liz, for another thought on the administration? A lot of people think if we have a crisis that it would be with China, of course. Well, Trump promised to tear up the trade agreements, said they were very unfair to America. A lot of workers agreed with him. A lot of your members agreed with him. Understanding how you feel about the shutdown right now and the damage of that, but he did tear up NAFTA. He's got a new trade agreement. He's in the middle of trade negotiations with China. Is he delivering in the way that, whether your member agreed with him or not in a particular case, there was a lot of frustration with those deals. Isn't he delivering and changing the paradigm a little bit?
Well, I think the new NAFTA, of course, they've made progress in some areas. We think the labor standards and a number of other chapters need work. There's still time, and of course the enforcement piece is going to be the big question.
But still time. But are you inclined to want to back this and have Congress support this deal? We
want fair trade, and we want strong labor protections. And if there is an administration willing to work with us on that, that's what we're going to do.
And you just to be clear, do you think you're going to be able to make the progress that you're talking about?
As it stands now, we are not endorsing this deal. But as I said, we believe there's still time. And the enforcement piece, of course, has to go to Congress. And so we'll continue in that conversation. But I think what you're touching on is the fact that working people had an expectation in the election. During Trump's campaign, he was essentially taking a page out of our playbook, which was talking about how the trade rules haven't worked for working people, the devastation that we'd seen all across the country, particularly in the Midwest, with factories shuttered, the outsourcing, people losing their jobs. Working people wanted that message, and they clung to it. And in some cases, upwards of, I think, high 20s, almost 30% of working people in the labor movement, that message appealed to them. And so after the election, how has his popularity fared? I think working people have seen no results, empty words in terms of the promises kept in delivering on huge priorities that we thought would put people back to work. Infrastructure is one big priority that was talked about on the campaign trail. We have a, $3.2 trillion deficit in terms of investment in infrastructure. And that was going to promise big job growth, and it has not moved. So I think it is time, and I wanted to respond to what David said earlier about our options. We know that we have a consumer-driven economy, and the inequality that we've seen with these tax cuts going to the wealthiest, to corporations and the wealthiest in our country, that consumers don't have money in their pockets because wages have not been steadily rising over the decades where we've been flat. So if you don't have money in your pocket as a consumer, you're not investing in that virtuous cycle of growth that we so desperately want to contribute to. And that is also preventing companies from making those investments.
For those who are not American and may not understand, the NAFTA agreement could have stayed in effect. The new agreement has to be approved by Congress. And if it's not approved by Congress, NAFTA, unless the president gets out of it, and he can legally get out of it, would stay in effect. Now, it's not clear that the Democrats in Congress want to give a victory to President Trump. So it's not really clear that that will ever be approved by at least the Democrats in the House. So it's unclear. One of the advantages of the negotiation with China is that it almost is certainly the case that it'll be structured in a way that doesn't have to be approved by Congress. Because once again, it's not likely that the Democrats in the House are going to give President Trump a big victory by approving his agreement, whatever it might be. So because it doesn't have to be approved by Congress, I think there's a pretty good chance it will go into effect when it does get negotiated.
Quickly, Brian.
That's the point I was going to say, David, is that having this explained by the people in Congress, it actually probably increases the pace at which a China resolution can happen, because if you don't have it go through Congress, you don't have a full trade deal, it's much easier to cut a series of transactions. And I think that's the common wisdom is that should happen fairly quickly.
I want to move on to a slightly broader thing, but before I do, if I can, I just want one-word answers from everybody. Is the U.S. position in the world economically stronger or weaker than it was 2 years ago right now? You want to start?
Relatively stronger.
Stronger.
Relatively stronger is 2 words. I would say
When you speak as
One
quickly
word,
So
David.
that's why,
We'll come
I
back.
used
We'll come back.
inflection. Did you hear my
I
inflection?
would say
also
improving.
relatively
Improving.
stronger.
Getting weaker.
Sorry,
Getting weaker.
Stronger.
stronger. Okay, let's talk a little bit more broadly then. So the political situation remains volatile, obviously, in the United States right now. Like elsewhere in the world, we're polarized. The parties are going more to extremes. You heard Liz talk a little bit about the appeal that Trump had for many of her members who would traditionally be Democrats. But as we head into the election, we have, I think, at this moment, 45 or 50 Democrats have declared for office back home, probably more this week as we're going. David, are we possibly headed for a much more leftward swing in the political direction of the U.S.?
There's no doubt
response.
that the Democrats who got elected in this term, first-term members in the House of Representatives, are more liberal than the people they've replaced. That's obvious. Joe Crowley was defeated, replaced by somebody who's much more liberal. And
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez,
OCA.
who also has the Twitter gift that you
And
were
a better
talking about
dancer.
earlier. Yeah.
And so I think that's the case, and I think Nancy Pelosi's in a difficult position because she's got a party that's much more left-leaning than it was before. So I suspect you will see some drift to the left. Right now, we don't know what the exact consequences are going to be. It's not likely that any major legislation can get passed that's leftward-leaning out of the House and become law, because it's unlikely the Senate is going to approve anything.
Well, when you look ahead to 2020 and you see this process is only beginning, obviously it's way too early to make a prediction, but the energy's on the left and the Democrats for sure.
Thing I would just point out is that if you go back the last 10 presidential elections, think about each of them in your head, last 10, 2 years in advance, who you thought was going to be president, you would have been wrong in almost every single case. You wouldn't have predicted 2 years in advance Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, John F. Kennedy. You wouldn't have predicted them. So it's hard to say what will happen 2 years in advance. Yeah. There are too many uncertainties. It's clear, though, that the Democratic Party right now feels its oats from being more left-leaning than it probably was a number of months ago. Whether they can get anything through the Congress, I'm skeptical of at the moment, though.
Liz, you're nodding your head, though. Do you feel the energy going that way in your membership?
I do. And if you look at who got elected in this last cycle, there are more women, more people of color, more working class people. And in fact, the labor movement has made it a priority to invest in working family candidates from our own ranks. And we had, I think, over 800 union members elected at various levels of government. But I think they were ushered in this last cycle based on a working person's economic message. And that is what we have been missing previously in the Democratic Party, is that message that says, hey, I know what working people are going through. I know what we need to do to create jobs in this country, good paying jobs that have benefits and security. We do not want to see this race to the bottom and have working people bear the brunt of what's happening in the economy. And so I do see the rise of more we call them working family friendly candidates because of the way the policies have been so broken, the laws have been so broken.
This is a problem. When you get to be an old white male, I've spent my whole life trying to be an old white male with power, and now that I am an old white male with some power, they tell me it's not good to be an old white male anymore. So it's disappointing, but nothing I can do about it.
I think the other thing, though, just to note, is that increasingly there are more and more people frustrated with both parties, and I think that's a sentiment.
Independence.
Yeah, independence. I mean, certainly we're not going to head in that direction in a meaningful way, but I think actions we actually see come from the government, to the extent they're influenced by centrists who actually are disappointed with what we're seeing on both ends.
Brian, what's your read when you hear it? I mean, from the perspective of the company, but also from all of your customers out there, do you think the political landscape is going to shift again, and what would that mean?
I 100% agree with David, and I do informal polls with my management team and my board and say, give me, when we have meetings leading up to elections, give me your thoughts. And you could not find some of the people who are present, 24 months before. So we don't know. There'll be a lot of between here and there. David's view about, when does a slowdown hit, what happens, there'll be things. But clearly, in Stacey's view, there needs to be a good discussion in both parties about what they stand for, and neither party has had it. So I think what Speaker Pelosi will face is not disanalogous to what Speaker Boehner faced when he had the wave come in, and everybody thought, well, you have this all, and he couldn't get the votes through his own party before he had to deal with what else was going on. So I think there's a battle about these parties that you'll see play out, and we as citizens, I don't have a special perspective because it's. We as citizens in the United States are going to have to make decisions in both parties.
Do you think business particularly, which obviously has a big interest in this, do you think everybody everywhere will listen to business at this point? Because one of the things about Trump, you're nodding your head no, Stacey, why don't you? Because one of the appeals, I think, and it was clear for people, a lot of people in business with the president, they may not have liked him, they may not have voted for him, but they feel he's got their ear. Are there alternatives to a Donald Trump Republican Party for companies right now?
I mean, I think when you talk about companies, yes, and I never really got to answering the question, the first part about the actions that the administration had taken, and I do think that what we hear from companies, and we have global companies, right? But in the U.S., where some of the actions are certainly more impactful, they're relatively optimistic, right? The new tax bill, and they've seen that benefit from them throughout their organizations. But there's a lot of uncertainty that's been created at the same time. And so that optimism is really dependent on resolution on all these other topics that we're talking about. So I think there's a good dialogue with business and the president. But I don't think that the general population feels like business at this point in time has their interest at heart, and I think that's what we need to change.
So it would be interesting to see business have how business would relate with President Warren, for instance. But
I think they would feel like they got hit by a ton of bricks if that happened.
Can I take you to one other area, because it's fun to talk politics, we're doing it, but really, in many ways, maybe the biggest topic in the air at Davos, I think, this year might be about the U.S. and China and where they're at. So, and one thing I think that's true in the political dynamic in the U.S. right now is the left and the right both share wariness of China and the future of the relationship with China, maybe for the first time with this kind of common thinking in quite some time. So how does the U.S.-China dynamic evolve in the next decade? Is it inevitable that China is just going to outpace the U.S. in the size of its economy, and we're going to have to learn to live with that? What do you see taking place here going forward and the debate looking like?
Well, I think it's probably inevitable that China outpaces the United States, but will it be 40 years, 400 years? I don't know. I mean, I think that's unclear. And you're absolutely right that in many ways, these very aggressive trade policies don't, the way they're expressed, David said it's not like he's talking Shakespeare, but there's a lot of consensus in Washington. Positions have really hardened around China. Where I think there's a disagreement is what is it we don't like about it? And President Trump says it's the trade imbalance, which except for his economic advisor, Peter Navarro, I don't think you can find anyone who agrees with the economist who agrees with that. That's really benign. We're borrowing the money, and that's going to be their tough luck if we don't pay it. But on the other hand, the intellectual property rights, the forced transfer of intellectual property rights. I mean, these are big issues. And I think something had to happen, because there are certainly people feeling in the United States, we might wake up someday and go, oh no, what have we done?
Are they right to feel that? Or is there just, is there a real concern, or more a kind of an unnecessary anxiety that's built up?
I mean, I tend to have a benign view of it, that we in the United States didn't respect Britain's intellectual property rights in the 1800s. And then when we started to be the innovator, suddenly we thought it was a great idea to have intellectual property rights. And I think it's a fair chance we'll see a similar dynamic.
Do you think there's a risk of some broader decoupling, or that the U.S. and China could really disengage in big ways?
Well, I think the mood, my impression of the mood at Davos is that it's somewhat muted. And I think I can't put my finger on why it is, but certainly the concern over the trade war just seeming a lot more real than the rhetoric over globalization that we've heard until now. Nobody's quite sure how bad it will be, how it will play out, what unintended consequences will be. That's certainly something on everybody's mind.
Brian, you wanted to jump in.
I was going to switch the focus of Davos just a hair, but
David, you want to
say that John Kenneth Galbraith, a famous Harvard economist, once said, the conventional wisdom is almost always wrong. So the conventional wisdom in Davos is always X or Y or Z, and it turns out a year later it's almost always wrong, as it was last year. But that's okay. It makes life interesting. Let me just talk about the China situation. What happens to people who may not have followed it as much, maybe just get my perspective. The Chinese government for a long time heard American politicians rail against their various trade practices and intellectual property practices. And then when these people got elected, nothing really got done. So when Trump said these things in the campaign, I don't think the Chinese government took it that much more seriously than when other people had said it. When he came in and actually did some things that they thought he was not likely to do because of the good relationship he had established on a personal rapport with Xi Jinping, they were surprised. They then realized that he was serious and they had to do something about it. They also realized that he represents at least 40 to 45% of the American people, if not more, and that if he were to die tomorrow, whoever his successor would be would likely have similar, if not identical, policies. So they decided they had to do something about it and actually come to an agreement. Their problem was they didn't know who to negotiate with because there were several different negotiators, and they didn't know exactly what President Trump wanted because he hadn't yet defined exactly what he wanted. Now that Bob Lighthizer has been given the mandate to be the principal negotiator, and he's a very skilled negotiator and a very knowledgeable person, he's a special trade representative in the United States, he, I think, is going to bring together a deal because I think the Chinese really want a deal. They think it's not going to solve all their problems and it's not going to have the Americans be quiet on everything they do in China, but they think a deal will be helpful. And I think the president realizes he's being hurt in some parts of the economy, and particularly in the agriculture sector, by the tariffs and so forth. So he wants a deal. So I think a deal will get done within the next 2 or 3 months, maybe 4 months.
But even with a deal, we're still going to be engaged for a long time.
Well, forever. In the history of the world, you've never had the two biggest economies always say, hey, we're great friends, we're always going to do things together well. You always have headbutting between the two biggest economies, so nothing is going to go away in that regard.
Stacey, you want to do
I think it's just interesting also if you take that down a level, obviously while the trade conversations are going on, and you look at other people within the countries are trying to forge partnerships sort of in spite of all the dialogue that's happening. And so we have a lot of conversations both with Chinese regulators and others who are looking to say, let's not let this noise distract us from our day-to-day work. And hopefully we can sort of push things up as well in partnership-wise. I mean, we didn't see a slowdown on the companies that chose to come public in the U.S. from China at the end of the year there.
But let me ask one question on that, though. Should U.S. companies be worried about the competition from Chinese companies over time? I mean, is that an issue facing U.S. companies in terms of our hegemony?
So the interesting question is that we get a lot of questions in America about the banking, the concentration of banking market share and things like that. So if you look at the top earning bank in the fourth quarter in America, it'll be us, and JP will be a little bit behind us, and Wells will be a little bit behind that. But when you end up stacking up the earnings from the Chinese banks, unless something goes wrong, will be somewhere either third and fifth or fourth and fifth out of the top 5 banks. And those institutions are already much bigger scale, earning $40 billion a year. The only company I think that out-earns the biggest Chinese bank in the United States might be Apple. It's probably Apple and stuff. So there's powerful franchises coming around the world. And when they decide to come, they're going to come. So they've already done it. And so I think the competition from China is going to be real. And the structure of that, though, is in the United States, that'd be one enterprise because the government owns 60% of all the different banks. But when they come, they're going to come hard.
Do you agree with that? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, there's competition, and that's no surprise. I don't think that. I certainly think that business leaders here in the U.S. are aware of the competition that exists.
Are they doing what is necessary? Do you think? And does the U.S. government get it? And I ask that because we were talking before. In one way, we're in very good shape, but we've got half as many public companies in the U.S. today as we did 20 years ago. We've got a lot more we've had a lot more capital move into the private markets. Small business is coming out back, but really took it on the chin. Do you feel we're in a healthy corporate environment?
No,
broadly?
I think that's a totally different topic, though. In many ways, I think the number of public companies is down by half over a 20-year period. The average company is 6 times the size what it was before. We've created a landscape that works well for very large companies and large investors, and the large investors can go play in the private markets. And I do think that contributes to the dialogue we've been having here this week about the divide of wealth, because we're denying the everyday investor from being able to take advantage of the serious growth trajectories that
The
companies
principal
have.
problem that China has right now, among other things, is they can't invest very much in the United States because of CFIUS and other rules. So what China has done smartly is say, well, we'll invest in Europe, we'll invest in Africa, we'll invest in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and they are beginning to be much more significant investors in these countries, particularly their technologies, than the United States is. And if the United States doesn't recognize that soon, our companies don't compete in these other areas, and soon you'll have technology in Africa that's Chinese more than is American, and that's not to the benefit of Americans. So I do think we have to recognize that Chinese are frustrated they can't invest in the United States, so they're going to invest elsewhere, and that's going to continue for quite some time.
That'll affect global power. Okay, I do want to go for questions. Sorry, Liz. Can I do 3 very quick lightning things, yes or no? Or Ken, I'll start with you to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask 3 questions, and I just want to know yes or no. Recession in the U.S. within 2 years?
No.
Liz?
Possible.
David?
Don't know.
No.
No.
Okay, trade deal with China on the deadline. Ken?
Said yes or no, by this is what we're supposed to say.
Yeah, well, or
Trade
you
deal
know.
with Thai on the deadline? No.
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 Yes.
Yes.
Not sure what the deadline is, but yes.
Well, that was my hesitation.
I think you're my bank. That makes me worried. Now,
No, you said-
okay, last one, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. President Trump, 2 terms or 1?
Oh, this is painful.
So that's not really a yes or no question.
50-50.
Oh, come on.
I-
1 term. If
He ha-
not half a term.
Sorry.
No, I'm just kidding.
Keep in mind, he could be watching the live stream right now. I'll just point out. Go ahead.
I think it's too early to say.
That's it.
Oh,
Sorry. I want to be accurate.
2?
No idea.
No idea. Okay.
You don't know.
You want to go to questions out here? We've got a couple mics roaming around. They can find you. There's one there. I see a question over here. Just identify yourself for the audience, please.
I'm Nicolas Mariscal from Mexico. Whatever happens in the U.S. affects Mexico, as you all know quite well. So what's going on in the U.S., we would like to know and would like to have some ideas of, for example, the wall, one thing, the immigrants coming, the guns control in the U.S. All these issues, I would like to hear your outcome of all these issues because they're affecting us very much. Thank you.
Who wants to jump on that? Come on.
I would say on the wall, just to put it in perspective, this was the president's signature campaign promise. And I think many people in his party said, how can you run for re-election without having honored in a meaningful way your major promise? The Democrats, by contrast, have said, if we let him have his major campaign promise, this will ease his re-election. So they have said under no circumstances are they going to support the wall. And so you've got these bipolar positions, and there doesn't seem to be compromise. As we all know, there already is some wall there, but it is not called the Trump wall because he hasn't actually put his imprimatur on it yet. I suspect, like most things in Washington, it will drag out for some time until after the next election.
You wanna add
I
to
think
this?
just pull back to the broader question of immigration and policy. You know, there was a bipartisan bill for many years put on a table to have a comprehensive immigration, which was worked with labor and business and the states along the borders and everything. And it never progressed under the last administration. I think even maybe it goes back even before that. And so what David's point earlier about, those things aren't going to get done. But what's interesting in the dialogue that goes on now, you see pieces of it get thrown out there. And so optimism would say, hey, maybe we'll figure this out, that this is really the core issue. We have to have population growth in the United States. We're going about half the rate. The way we do that is through immigration. We had 75 million workers 50 years ago. We have 150 million today. That came from people coming to this country. That's what we got to do. That's what makes us interesting and fun. We are a big economy, and we grow our population at a pretty decent rate. So I think you hope that happens, but I think the reality is, and the pragmatist in me is, with the Congress arrayed the way they are and the dynamics David talked about, you don't see it happening. So I think all those issues you talk about are issues, but only the things that have to get done to stop a shutdown or the incremental progress is, I think, all that can be on the table right now.
Can I go for another question? I'm sorry. Any other questions? You want to jump in on that one, Liz, quickly before?
Well, I was just going to say the wall is a political distraction, in our opinion. The timing of it during the election was uncanny to really divert people's attention from the real issues, which are, obviously the economic issues that are happening in our country. And the plight of workers who are undocumented in the US is they're working in a shadow economy. And until we have comprehensive immigration reform in the US where everyone is treated fairly, can work for a decent wage, and not be exploited, it's going to be a drag on our economy.
Questions? Anyone?
Left.
More? Oh, there's one right here. Sorry.
Michael Jarl from Denmark. I just want to ask you, how do you assess that Europeans are trying to challenge the American dollar power by establishing a new mechanism so they can work around the Iran sanctions? And Russia and China is doing the same, trying to establish a trade system outside the dollar.
Ken, you want to do that one?
I think the fact is that the dollar dominance is growing and growing and growing. And the euro is just completely flatlined, even started shrinking in its global footprint. Maybe as the European economy recovers, stabilizes, not happening so decisively yet, that will change. But there's a natural monopoly. I think the next currency after the dollar will be the renminbi. I don't think the euro is ever going to be more than a secondary
Do you see
currency. But on your issue about SWIFT, which was what you're asking about, which I think the fact that because the dollar's grown and grown, all the infrastructure, the pipelines of the global financial system, now not only dollar, the US controls it because the Federal Reserve can back it. The Europeans are trying to do something, they should. But they're real economies of scale. There are real problems here. So this may not work at scale that they hope. Right now, a lot of European corporations are actually borrowing in dollars.
And the renminbi, which has been talked about probably when I think about Davos predictions of the past, probably 10 years ago, someone was at Davos saying the dollar's day is done. That's really going quite slowly.
Way in the future. But
Right. For the U.S., the dollar is our sovereign wealth fund. We don't have a sovereign wealth fund, but by having this printing press and people want to buy our dollars, it's effectively our sovereign wealth fund because people have to buy these dollars because there's no other currency that's really equivalent. So it enables us to finance everything very, very cheaply.
We had another one out there, I think.
Hi, I'm Marco Holironi from Argentina, and I want to highlight Mr. Rubenstein's comment about how the Chinese are frustrated and investing in other places such as Latin America. One could argue that the American economic enterprises have retreated from Latin America and other places. So in the panel's view, do you think that this administration has the political mandate to bring back these American enterprises to engage with other places, and particularly Latin America?
I think that the American private equity investors and other investors have been burned a bit in the last few decades by going into Latin America always at the wrong time. When the prices seem to be good and the economies are good, people rush in and then it goes this way. I do think now, I shouldn't say this because I don't want my competition to rush into Latin America, but I do think that there are some terrific opportunities there now because there is relatively little foreign capital coming in. So Brazil, for example, which had a gigantic recession for a long time, now has a new government. I think the economy is coming back there. It's probably a very good time to invest there. I think Colombia is another place that's very attractive. I think Mexico also is very attractive. Chile as well, among other places. Peru. Argentina I don't know as well because we haven't invested there. But it's a place where, because you have a new government in effect, I think it's more attractive than it used to be. But I think that Americans have pulled out and other investors have pulled out because there's been so many currency problems. In Brazil, for example, the currency went down 35% against the US dollar. So if you had a good investment, you could still, in dollars, lose money. So I do think it's a good time to invest, but I don't want my competition to hear what I'm saying. I don't want them to go in, tell them not to come in and let me buy things cheaper.
Good thing this is a webcast.
Right. We've got a question over here, and then back there next.
Thank you very much. We heard that there is no...
Oh, sorry, remind us who you are.
I'm sorry, yeah, Shamar Mofsumov, I'm CEO of Sovereign Wealth Fund from Azerbaijan. We heard that you said that there is a possibility of, at least some of the people said it's possible, some people said they don't know, of a recession within the next 2 years. I wonder if there is a recession, is there enough toolkit, both fiscal and monetary, and the political will and capacity to implement them?
Do you want to take that one?
So the estimate, so our research is just a shade under 2% for 20, so 2.5 and 1.9. So that's not a recession, and that 1.9 would still be higher than most of the years other than the last couple. So nobody projects blue chips somewhere around the same thing. So nobody has it projected. Is there structural ability to do it? That's one of the reasons why the Fed, by what they've said, is they're intent upon continuing to move rates up because they want to take the accommodation out. So in the end of the day, they're not, quote, propping up the economy and stuff, and they've done it. And now they're at the bottom range. The neutral rate, I think, is exactly the expression they use. And right now, there's the market says no hikes next year. We say 2 in our research because we think the economy's stronger. So, there'll be room just because we've normalized a bit. Now, what they have lost, and they talk about a lot, is some of the mechanisms that were used in the last crisis. But I think the thing people have to remember is the last crisis in the United States almost can't happen right now because it was a consumer mortgage, which is the biggest asset class with the biggest number of people's, what would the right word be, confidence broken. There's 130 million households, 60 million that have mortgages. You had the worry that those 60 million people were not, because unemployment and other things going on, but the worry was they were over-borrowed and over-leveraged and therefore they couldn't pay. That doesn't exist today because of the structural reforms that were done. So the question of corporate debt and stuff, leveraged finance, you talk $2 trillion asset class. It doesn't affect half the households in America and then psychologically affect the rest. So we don't see that kind of setup, which would then say if we have some sort of recessionary environment, not in the next couple of years, obviously, but sometime out there, it's going to be more of it always affects the consumer, more of corporate side, and you'll see it, but much more shallow. Therefore, the tools that we had to have last time are not going to be needed. But there is concern of whether the structural tools have been curtailed too much.
So does that mean, I don't know if that means the U.S. is a good investment for Azerbaijan, but we had another question back there, I think.
Rebecca Corbin, CEO of Corbin Advisors from the U.S. I just want to ask a question with regard to the economy. So if we look back in 2015, right, we saw August 2015, China imploded, a lot of concern, a lot of volatility in the market. People thought we were going into a recession. It was a year, then we went into 2016. Corporations actually lowered expectations nadir in the market in February, and then we started to spike up again. Then Trump was elected, and he changed the narrative, right? So instead of recessionary headlines, he started talking about spending and making America great again. I do not support any party either. I'm an independent. But we saw a big psychological shift, and we also saw a lot of CapEx come into the market because people felt better about spending. In December of this year, we saw kind of the antithesis of that, right? And we track the markets, and we've seen some pretty strong degradation in orders, trucking, et cetera, some industrials pull back. I just wanted to get your understanding. Obviously, we have economists, we have very powerful business people, president of NYSE, CEOs. I mean, really, what is it that is going to stop this from fruition? Is it really just tariffs being taken off the table, interest rates kind of normalizing? But when you think about kind of the silver bullets, if there are any, what are you looking out since you are very connected in the world?
We got 2 minutes. You want to start with that one?
Well, first of all, recessions aren't that easy to predict. I mean, so we often don't know where they're coming from. By the way, we don't know where the next financial crisis is coming from. Most often, they are caused by a bit of overenthusiasm in hiking rates by the Federal Reserve. And so that does seem to have been reduced a bit. But I do think China is a big source of uncertainty. We've talked about the shutdown. By the way, you forced me into yes, no. I would have said 30 to 40% over the next 2 years. So I said no, but that was
of a chance of a recession.
Of a chance of a recession, yeah.
But, capital spending is predicted to be slower this year than it was last year. It went up and came down, and we'll see how that plays out. But at the end of the day, if you think about structurally in the U.S., if you subscribe to 2/3 of the economy as people, what is good as signal is when they slow down their consumption because they're worried about being employed and stuff like that. That you don't see so far. It doesn't mean you can't see it around the corner. But you are seeing accelerate their spending and unemployment go, the new claims number down the low. So in the spot market right now, employment's very strong. Wages are not growing in the ways that we would like to see based on the discussion on inequality, but they are growing, and unemployment is as strong as it's been. So I'd watch for consumer spending declines, and I'd watch for, as you said, sort of capital commitment declines. Right now, it might slow down, but you don't see people stopping.
Stacey,
and that's confidence, and that's going to come from confidence.
Yeah, I agree. That was what I was going to add is confidence is really important. So I think we just need to make sure that we can preserve investor confidence, and some of the issues that are creating anxiety, if they get resolved pretty quickly, I think that's the best case scenario.
Liz, you have any other thoughts on that?
We need
Silver bullets?
wage-led growth, and people are working 2 and 3 jobs. The quality of jobs has gone down. They're piecing things together to make ends meet. I believe that insecurity threatens our competitiveness.
David, I'm going to give you the last word
I think
on
what
this.
the world needs is more gatherings of people to talk about the problems of the economy. And I think that's the most important thing we can do is talk more about the economy, and I think that maybe that'll, make the economy feel good, and maybe it'll get to be strong.
And with that, this conversation is over. Thank you all very much.